did I do this? Why are you all here? Why the Foster Art and Wilderness Foundation, which we nicknamed the Foster to say fewer words? The genesis of the idea of the foundation was that having known Tony Foster since 1987 and having become his largest private collector of his works, I was with him in the spring of 2011 on the San Juan River, which there are paintings of, you can see in the Sacred Places space. And I had a quiet moment to sit on the edge of the river in what had been my noisy life. There was this point of incredible stillness where I watched Foster on a boulder out in the middle of the river on his little chair with his stove he cannot survive without making tea every 2 hours. So he had his stove and his mug, and he was busily engaged in creating a beautiful painting, and I was watching him. And it was a sacred moment for me, and it was also a moment where something I'd been carrying around for me for a long time just boiled to the surface, which was I couldn't tolerate the idea any longer of the beautiful journeys that Tony creates over a 3 to 5 year period of time out of a very small paint box and a wonderful Tupperware lid palette. He would do that, there would be a beautiful opening, and then maybe another opening, and then people like me would fight like crazy and obsess about how could I pick paintings out of this journey and bring them into my living room or my office. And I would be excited that I got a painting I really liked, but there was always the sickening sense that a journey had been fractured. And it was at that point on the river that I realized that as an artist, as my friend, as his largest collector, the thing I cared about most was protecting Tony's journeys and keeping them intact, making it possible for them to be intact. By the end of the river trip, I started talking to Tony about, might I acquire sacred places, then still being created, as an intact journey, not for me, but for the public good. I wanted audiences to be moved by his journeys the way I always have been. I wanted people to share that. I think when I first proposed it to Tony, he just looked at me like I'd landed from Mars, and we're old, good friends. But we kept playing with the idea, and for a few years, it started moving into an idea that had legs. But part of what's interesting and was terrifying to Tony, it was terrifying to my husband, and my friends looked at me and kind of said, is it was a different model. So the foundation exists. Its raison d'etre, if you will, is to hold the watercolor journeys of Tony Foster intact. And when you walked in, you saw a beautiful photograph of Tony at the Kaipur Falls in Guyana, and the quote, which is on our website as well, all my work is about journeys. So that is at the core of the foundation. In our mission, our goal is to take care of these journeys, to unite them, to celebrate them, to prepare them in exhibitions like you see with Sacred Places, with the goal that they're irresistible to the leaders of public art venues to take these journeys into their large-scale art venues, which this place is just a staging place. It's a place for a curator to come and fall in love and say, I want this for my art space and my public. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for those curators to fall in love here, we're going to be very engaged with our local community here of education and engagement and celebration of wilderness and how Tony connects us to it.
There are many aspects of Tony's work that are striking to me, and one is the element of risk that it involves. I asked him to talk about the daredevil quality. I mean, there's a different level of daredevilry in the technique, but just the dedication to going to these forbidding places, not necessarily alone, but alone enough, more alone than I would choose to be, and putting yourself through these ordeals of creativity. What could possibly make someone do that? I ask myself as a critic.
Well, I suppose the answer is that it's built up gradually, really. At first, I hadn't even conceived of the idea of doing work about wildernesses. I used to do work about walks across fairly safe places in Britain, Dartmoor or the Cornish coast or whatever it was. And it wasn't until I did a series about Henry Thoreau that I discovered that wilderness actually still existed. And that was, to me, a revelation and has been an inspiration ever since. And I suppose once I discovered that I was perfectly safe in the company of people who knew what they were doing, traveling around the wildernesses of Maine and following Henry Thoreau's footsteps, and then from then I moved on to doing a series about John Muir, and so that involved hiking the entire John Muir Trail, and that was a sort of a confidence-building development, really. And I suppose the truth is that the journeys have got sort of increasingly risky and increasingly hardy the longer I've been doing them, because I think my confidence has built up, and I'm now moderately confident, at least, to spend 10 days or a couple of weeks completely on my own in a place where I never see another human being. But that's built up gradually over the years, as I say, and there are times, certainly, when you have to face the possibility that you might be doing something risky, and you have to get yourself out of it. But most of the time, these places are not quite as risky as people would like to make out. If you were a writer of adventure stories or even travel books, you would have to wind up the aspect of it which made it appear really risky. But mostly, those things are a little exaggerated, I think. And I think there are only twice in my life, in my working life, that I've seriously felt that I might die. And it didn't, at the time, seem quite as much of a concern as I thought it was going to be. I realized that we all have to die sometime, and certainly on one of the occasions I thought, well, this is a pretty good place for it. But as it happened, I got myself out of that particular situation. But my point is that those things could equally happen on your sofa in your own front room. And so I guess it's something that's developed gradually, and I've increased in confidence. I've got to say now that I'm approaching very close to 70, sitting, at 15,000 feet in a howling gale at minus 10 degrees, as I was in Chile in November, up in the Andes, I did think to myself, what in God's name am I doing here? I've got a perfectly comfortable home at home. There's no real reason for me to crawl into a tent every night at minus 10 degrees and have to thaw my water out in the morning to have a cup of tea. So yeah, perhaps I'm on the downward curve.
I doubt it somehow, but and there's another level of risk involved in everything you make or everything you show. I'm sure
Yes.
there are things you don't show that
Yes.
you've made,
Plenty.
but given your productivity, the ratio seems very high of things you make to what you show, and that is the technical risk of launching into something. I think of this painting, which is not on view here, which I saw in the studio, this 4 by 7 foot view of the Grand Canyon, which is an immense achievement, technically speaking, and to set about to invest this much effort in, it isn't particularly hard to get to the Grand Canyon compared to some of the places you go, but still, it's an investment of time, effort, and will, and confidence to make this thing, which could easily fall apart on you internally at any number of points. So there's a kind of high wire act involved just in the technical proficiency that we see in these works. Because anyone who's worked in watercolor knows it can't be forced. It has to be obeyed. It has to be followed as a process of execution. And never mind the hostile conditions under which you work. It's bad enough working in the studio with watercolor, where you can control the climate and the wind and so on. But it's staggering to think that you again and again set out on these perilous journeys from blank page to finished work. I mean, that to me is a journey as perilous as some of the travel you undertake in a different way. But the risk of failure is it's more obvious, much more obvious. I mean, these are private journeys by and large. You have a few friends or associates with you, or
Right,
guides, whatever.
right.
But if you fail out there somewhere in the wilderness, nobody really has to know. It doesn't have to be on the internet the next day.
No.
But if you fail on the page, well, then it's a real confrontation for you, I would imagine. So.
Yeah.
However, have you developed the confidence to take these chances, the very chances we see, the bets we've seen won all around us here?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think in a way you touched on this slightly earlier on when you said that in some ways the technique isn't as risky as the journey, and I think that there is a connection between those two things, because if I've invested a lot of time and energy in planning a journey and a lot of money in getting to these particular places, then the time, then the energy, it goes in that order, to get to a place in order to make a painting. Well, first of all, the painting has to be of sufficient heft in order to make it worth all that effort. There wouldn't be much point in going all the way to Everest and coming back with a couple of paintings this size. That wouldn't satisfy what's required. And so the paintings have to be, I think, ambitious in scale, but on the other hand, I don't think they're that risky in technique. I mean, I think that if you were to look at Winslow Homer, I think you would think that he had a risky technique because he was very risky. He would take a lot of chance with his work, and he would sum up a landscape absolutely beautifully in a few brush strokes. And of course, I've always wished I could do that, but I think because I've invested so much time and effort in getting to this place, it's imperative that I come back to my studio with something which is going to work. And so I don't actually feel I can take big risks with the technique. So the work is fairly carefully organized in many ways, albeit it's on a large scale, but nonetheless, it's the technique itself is fairly tightly controlled, I think. And I sometimes struggle with that myself. I remember going to the Grand Canyon once when I was getting fed up with this idea that I actually have to sit in this same place for 10 days in order to make a painting, or 2 weeks, or 3 weeks sometimes, in order to make one painting. And I was getting fed up with it. I thought, this is an absurd way to work. I must be able to break out of this way of working. And so I took a 6-foot sheet of paper, and 6 by 3. I put it up at the edge of the Grand Canyon. I camped next to it, and I worked on it for 21 days. And I stood back, and I thought, oh, damn it all, it's just the same Foster. I could not alter my way of working it at all. And I realized it's like trying to alter your handwriting. You know, if you're not painting in your natural way, then it shows. And I could not paint in any other way. This is just who I am. I must be, I suppose, I have a fairly analytical eye, I think. I'm not trying to make reproductions of the exact landscape. If I wanted to do that, I'd take a photograph. And I don't think there's any particular merit in accuracy. But what I'm trying to do is be truthful. And I suppose I'm being truthful about my response to the landscape. And I'm trying to be truthful to myself about what I say about it. And somehow that results in these pictures that I do. And of course, the paintings aren't finished on site. They're probably 2/3 done on site, generally speaking. And they're finished in my studio in Tywardreath. And in order to do that, I simply scribble notes on the painting about the colors, the mixture, the light, the whatever's happening, and notes to myself. But I simply write notes about how the painting has to be finished. In other words, you know, what the color of the foreground rocks should be, and so on, all those kinds of things, just written notes. And I rely on those quite a lot. But I also, if something happens in nature while I'm sitting there painting, and I'm not about to get my diary out and write it down, I simply scribble it on the side of the painting, and then I pick up on it afterwards if it still seems interesting when I come to put the final work together with its notes underneath and its symbolic objects and so on.
When I was in Tony's studio, he mentions these souvenirs that he collects, and you see many of them attached to the paintings. He has a wall covered, the largest wall actually,
yes.
is covered with little plastic bags filled with as yet undesignated souvenirs. I mean, they're not yet attached to painting. I'm sure they are in his mind, but I took a picture of this because I've never seen anything quite like it in an artist studio. It occurred to me that there's an affinity between a lot of things Tony does and certain tendencies in conceptual art of our time. And I mentioned Richard Long and asked him whether he had an affinity for Richard Long's work, and he avowed that indeed he did. He is a big admirer of Richard Long's work. The whole idea being that your attention and the person behind it, the person that embodies it, travels in the world and brings something back, which would otherwise be unavailable to anyone but the individual. And so I was kind of struck by that. I found that very confirming.
But honestly, if I could paint like Winslow Homer, I would.
Well, who wouldn't, actually? Who among us wouldn't do that if they could? Now, in sort of the broad view of contemporary art, there's a kind of implicit division between the technically accomplished studio work, or work done on site, for that matter, and art with an activist impulse to it. Now, maybe it's the foundation that's providing the sense that there is a kind of activist program lying behind this work. But I'm wondering if there is, in your mind, a sense of mission about what you do. This has become a project of many decades, a series of connected projects, and they all seem increasingly, as I look at them through time, to connect with our consciousness of global warming or the crises that might follow from it, and with the sense that there are certain social forces, economic forces, cultural forces that have become unstoppable, and that the environments you choose to report are those that are not yet corrupted or assaulted visibly, or overtly visibly. I guess maybe crumbling glaciers might give the lie to that idea. But I'm wondering if there is, or when they're entered into your sense of what you do, some kind of activist motive, or if it hasn't entered yet, or if really this is for you more than it's for us.
Well, yes, in a way it's increased throughout the 30 odd years I've been doing this. It's not difficult to find a rationale behind it. I mean, if you go and sit in a rainforest and you're doing paintings about the extraordinary nature of these completely untouched places, but you can hear the chainsaws in the background and you can hear trees crashing, then it doesn't take a great deal of a leap of imagination to think that you might try and do something about this. And so I suppose the places that I go to are increasingly under pressure. A classic example would be the Plátano River in Honduras, supposedly a World Heritage Site, an untouched river which I and some friends, some of whom are in the audience, traveled. We did a 14-day raft journey down the Plátano River, and at that time it was completely untouched. It was hard to get to the top of the river, a very tough trek to get up there. We rafted down it, and I think for the first 12 days we didn't see any evidence of human beings. We saw no buildings, we saw no incursion into the forest, we saw no cut trees, we saw squads of scarlet macaws, we saw anteaters, we saw monkeys every day, the place was teeming with wildlife, so it obviously hadn't been hunted. And I read a report recently that the entire area is now being destroyed. And it was the most classically beautiful piece of rainforest. And it's the case wherever you look. I mean, it's not always overt destruction, like, tearing down the trees or digging up for mining or whatever. It might simply be things that seem to be for the best, like tourism, increasing tourism so that people can make a living who happen to live there. But with the advent of mass tourism, of course, it destroys whatever it is people went there to see in the first place. And so all these pressures are enormous, and I can't pretend I've got the answer to any of them. But all I can do as a painter is to bring back to everybody who doesn't have the good fortune that I have to go and see these places for themselves, to bring back to them evidence of how extraordinarily beautiful they are, and perhaps be one element of an argument that says that these things should be preserved. I know it's a sort of feeble rationale, really, because it doesn't. I can't pretend that I'm changing the world. I mean, there are small things that I do occasionally, like my schools in Honduras, or buying bits of rainforest, or helping with conservation organizations, or raising money for things, or giving lectures, or whatever. But generally speaking, my efforts are feeble. But as a painter, I don't know how else I could approach that. But yeah, it's an increasing sense that the pressures are getting greater on these places.
One of the things that strikes me when I look at many of these works is the consistency of not only the sort of persuasiveness of the point of view you've chosen, and how you do that is a mystery to me, and maybe to you too. But you have some sort of compass, artistic compass, clearly that really helps out. But the sense of a time of day. I mean, these things can't be done in a matter of hours, most of them,
no.
or even a matter of days, perhaps. And yet, the feeling that the sun has been in place, that you've stopped the sun, is very convincing, And yet, it's nothing like the sense you get in a photograph of a kind of mechanically imposed consistency. So, how do you manage the unities, if you will?
Well, I'm flattered that you've noticed that. It's I think people think that I only paint this painting for 20 minutes at a certain time of day. But of course, the way I work is that I'm painting all day, every day, dawn till dusk. But what I'm doing is I'm putting in the sort of local colour and the sort of basic underpainting and trying to get the texture of the rocks or whatever it is, and as I say, the basic underpainting, and I'm doing that all the time, all day. And then, as I'm watching, I mean, some of them might take, a big painting might take 2 or 3 days just to do the drawing. So the drawing might take 2 or 3 days, and then I start to paint it after that. Well, after you've sat and watched the sun go from east to west every day for 2 or 3 days, you begin to realize just when that place looks at its best. It might be 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or it might be 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it might be 10 o'clock in the morning, it could any time. But you see where the shadows are helping to describe the landscape and helping to show the shape of everything, and where the place looks absolutely at its best. And that's what I'm trying to find. And I watch that happen over the period that I'm doing the underpainting and so on. And then I simply, the next day when I get to that point, say 10 o'clock in the morning, I look and I simply put the shadows in, overpainting what I've got underneath. And I think the difference between that and a photograph, if you look at a photograph, mostly the shadows are black in a photograph. And I never use photographs because the colors are just hopeless. They do not describe what you can see with your naked eye. And so if you really look at a shadow, you will see that there's all sorts of colors underneath it. And that's what I've been painting up to that point. And then when I see the shadows, where I want them to be, I put them in. And once you've started to do that, then of course the painting has got its logic. And everything else after that has to follow that logic. You can't have the sun at 10 o'clock in the morning on one side and then think, oh, it'd be nice to have the shadow the other side on this tree. And so it has to follow that logic. And so that's how it maintains, and thank you for noticing, maintains that unity. I mean, all of these paintings mean a great deal to me because they're all a very important part of my life. I mean, each one, to me, it tells, an enormous amount about, I can send myself straight back to Greenland by looking at that painting, or straight back to Death Valley by looking at that one. And so they all have a deep attachment to me, or I have a deep attachment to them. And one of the worst moments of my life is when the truck comes and parks outside number 1 Well Street, and the men take away the paintings for an exhibition, and I'm left bereft of all these things that I've been working on for 3 or 4 years. And so I'm deeply attached to all of them, really. But the place I've been back to most often, I think, is the Grand Canyon, because it is just endlessly varied. I've traveled into the canyon. I think I've probably hiked, 300 or 400 miles in the canyon altogether at different times, if I had it all together. And it is that you are never bored there, because the light is changing all the time, shapes come and go. Something detaches itself from the North Rim, or appears to, and becomes a butte on its own, and then re-emerges with the North Rim. Things alter all the time depending on the light, and it is endlessly fascinating. And I can see now why it's always been such a huge icon for artists and photographers, because it is just such an extraordinarily fabulous place. Many, many intimate places. When you get down into the canyon, there are so many intimate, tiny, but beautiful places. And then these huge, enormous vistas. That's an extraordinary place. And so I think my Grand Canyon stuff is the place I'm most attached to. But I wouldn't say I had a favorite painting, really. Some were harder to do, and if I've succeeded because they were so hard to do, and if I've succeeded in doing them, then I'm very fond of those. The east face, actually it's not here, but it's somewhere around. The east face of Everest was one particular place which was incredibly hard to get to, very, very difficult to work in, and the painting turned out fantastic. So that's one of my favorites. But that's only because it was tough to do and turned out well. So I'm sorry I can't pick out one that you should take home with you.